Albert Speer was Hitler's architect, the man who designed monuments to a 1,000-year Reich that lasted 12 years. He was the armaments minister who kept Germany's war machine functioning through Allied bombing and inevitable defeat. Unlike the other Nazi leaders, he accepted responsibility at Nuremberg, expressed remorse, and crafted an image as the good Nazi, the cultured technocrat who claimed ignorance of the Holocaust. But for his wife, Margarete, and their 6 children, the man on trial was also a husband who had been increasingly absent since 1933, a father they barely knew. They would wait 20 years for his release from Spandau prison, only to discover that the distance between them had become unbridgeable. Their story is one of waiting and disappointment, of children trying to reconcile the loving father they remembered with the war criminal history condemned, of a family fractured by fame, guilt, and unspoken truths. May 1945. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, member of the Flensburg government that briefly succeeded Hitler, was arrested by British forces on May 23rd while shaving in temporary headquarters at Buckeburg Castle. For Margarete Speer and their 6 children, the arrest meant the beginning of an ordeal that would reshape their lives. They were living near Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, close to where Hitler's Berghof had stood, before Allied bombs reduced it to rubble. The children ranged in age from 11-year-old Albert Jr. down to 3-year-old Ernst. Between them came Hilda, Fritz, Margaret and Arnold, originally named Adolf after Hitler himself, a name the family would quietly change after the war. The children had spent their formative years in privilege and proximity to power. They lived in beautiful homes, played in the alpine landscape, were photographed with Hitler and Eva Braun. Their father designed the Reich Chancellery, planned the reconstruction of Berlin, commanded millions of workers, including slaves and concentration camp prisoners. But to the children, he was simply father, a distant figure who worked constantly, visited rarely, and seemed more married to his profession and to Hitler than to their mother. Hilda later recalled that her father came to their Berchtesgaden home rarely, not more than once a month. I suppose it was only when Hitler was there. Margarete herself admitted that the children hardly knew him. For all intents and purposes, the children didn't have a father, yet the children loved him anyway, or loved the idea of him, the rare moments when he paid attention, the pride they felt in his accomplishments. When 10-year-old Albert Jr. watched Nazi Germany collapse and heard that his father was being held as a war criminal, he developed a severe stutter that would plague him for years. The boy processed the trauma physically, his speech disrupted by the disruption of his world. The youngest children were too young to understand. Arnold later thought that war criminal was simply his father's new profession, not grasping that it meant condemnation rather than employment. Margarete moved the family to Heidelberg, Speer's birthplace, in the American occupation zone. She settled them in the ancestral Speer home, away from the devastation of Obersalzberg, away from the curious eyes and whispered accusations. Germany was starving. The occupation zones implemented strict rationing. Adults received as little as 1,000 to 1,500 calories daily. The Speer children, accustomed to privilege, now faced the hardships that ordinary Germans had endured throughout the war. But they had one advantage. They were young, innocent in the eyes of denazification authorities. Margarete's role had been peripheral, merely the wife, not a party member or official. The family was spared the harshest reprisals even as Albert faced trial. The Nuremberg proceedings began in November 1945. Albert Speer was indicted on 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented evidence of his role in exploiting forced labor, expanding Auschwitz, using concentration camp prisoners in weapons production, evicting Jews from Berlin apartments. Speer's defense rested on acceptance and deflection. He admitted general responsibility for the regime's crimes while denying specific knowledge of the Holocaust. He claimed he had been a technocrat, focused on production, willfully blind to the atrocities occurring around him. He expressed remorse, acknowledged guilt, and positioned himself as the one Nazi leader capable of recognizing his failures. The judges were persuaded. On October 1st, 1946, Speer was convicted on counts 3 and 4, war crimes and crimes against humanity, but acquitted of the conspiracy charges. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. He would serve every day of it in Spandau prison in Berlin, alongside 6 other convicted Nazis, including Rudolf Hess, Baldur von Schirach, and Grand Admiral Erich Raeder. For Margarete and the children, 20 years meant waiting through the entirety of the children's remaining childhoods and young adulthoods. Albert Jr. was 12. He would be 32 when his father was released. Ernst was 4. He would be 24, an adult who barely remembered a father who wasn't imprisoned. The family visited Spandau when permitted, awkward encounters across barriers where Speer maintained a facade of paternal affection. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, smuggled out against prison rules, eventually published as Spandau, The Secret Diaries. The letters constructed a narrative of remorse and reflection, of a father separated from his beloved family by circumstances he regretted. But the letters also revealed Speer's primary concern, his own rehabilitation, his image, his place in history. The children were characters in his story rather than individuals in their own right. The visits to Spandau were traumatic in their own way. The children would travel to Berlin, wait in institutional rooms, then spend brief supervised periods with their father through barriers or across tables. He would ask about their lives, but seemed more interested in telling them about his reading, his garden, his imaginary travels around the world. He dispensed advice about their education and careers from a position of enforced ignorance about the realities they faced. How could a man in prison for war crimes meaningfully guide his children through post-war Germany? Yet he tried, asserting paternal authority he had never really exercised even when free. Albert Jr. later recalled the confusion of these visits. His father seemed kind, concerned, intelligent, nothing like the monster described in newspapers and history books. The boy struggled to reconcile the two images, to understand how the man who asked about his studies and encouraged his interest in architecture could be the same man responsible for working millions of slaves to death. This cognitive dissonance plagued all the children. They experienced Speer as a father, however distant. The world knew him as a war criminal. Both were true, but holding both truths simultaneously required psychological gymnastics that left lasting scars. Margarete's position was perhaps the most difficult. She had married Speer in 1928, waited patiently while he completed his studies, endured his mother's disapproval. By the time the children arrived, Speer was already deeply involved with the Nazi Party, already spending more time with Hitler than with his wife. She had raised 6 children essentially alone during the war years while he travelled constantly and worked impossibly long hours. Now she waited again for 20 years, visiting when allowed, writing letters, maintaining the household on whatever resources remained. She could have divorced him. Many German women divorced their imprisoned husbands after the war, but Margarete stayed, whether from loyalty, religious conviction, practical concerns, or simple inertia, she remained Frau Speer. The decision shaped her children's understanding of duty and complicity. During his imprisonment, Speer meticulously calculated the distance he walked each day in the prison exercise yard, imagining he was traveling the world on foot. By his release, he had walked from northern Germany through the Middle East, across Siberia into Alaska, and down to near Guadalajara, Mexico. He read over 500 books. He gardened, creating what the American commander called Speer's Garden of Eden. He wrote the first draft of his memoirs on toilet paper and tobacco wrappers, smuggling the pages out systematically. He made productive use of his time while his children grew up without him. Margarete raised the 6 children largely alone. She managed the household in Heidelberg, navigated the social stigma of being Albert Speer's wife, waited faithfully for his release. She visited when she could, wrote letters, maintained the fiction that they were still a family merely separated by circumstance. But the reality was more complex. Speer had been emotionally distant even before his arrest. He had been consumed by his work, his relationship with Hitler, his grand architectural visions. The marriage had been a convenience, entered into in 1928 against his mother's wishes. She thought Margarete Weber, daughter of a craftsman, was socially inferior. They married anyway, but it took 7 years before Speer's mother even invited Margarete to stay at the family home. The children began arriving in 1934, once Speer had steady income from the Nazi Party. Albert Jr., Hilde, Fritz, Margaret, Adolf, later Arnold, and Ernst came in regular succession over 8 years, often a sign of a happy marriage. But Speer's work increasingly took him away. When he visited, he was distracted, focused on plans and projects. He took skiing trips and holidays with his team and friends like Eva Braun and Magda Goebbels, not with his family. The children experienced him as an absence punctuated by brief appearances, someone to impress rather than someone who knew them intimately. On October 1st, 1966, after serving his full 20-year sentence, Albert Speer walked out of Spandau prison. He was 61 years old. The world had changed dramatically during his imprisonment. Germany had been divided into East and West. The economic miracle had transformed West Germany into a prosperous democracy. His children were adults: Albert Jr., 42, Hilda, 30, Fritz, 29, Margaret, 28, Arnold, 26, Ernst, 24. They had built lives, pursued careers, formed identities independent of him. And they discovered, as he spent his first hours of freedom in a Berlin hotel surrounded by reporters and photographers, that their father was more interested in crafting his public image than in reconnecting with them. Speer's release was a worldwide media event. He gave interviews, published his memoirs Inside the Third Reich to phenomenal success, portrayed himself as the repentant insider who could explain Hitler and the Nazi regime from a position of cultured reflection. The book became an international bestseller, translated into multiple languages, making Speer wealthy and famous. He revised history, omitted crucial details, invented scenarios that never occurred. His daughter Margaret later wrote in her 2005 memoir that after his release, her father spent all of his time constructing the Speer myth. He had no time or emotional energy left for his actual family. The children responded to this rejection in different ways. Albert Jr., who had followed in his father's footsteps and become an architect, never managed to re-establish a relationship despite their shared profession. Speer Sr. had been a distant father, but the son had hoped that 2 decades might have changed him, might have created space for connection. Instead, he found a man obsessed with his own rehabilitation, determined to control his narrative, using his family as props in the story of the good Nazi who had seen the error of his ways. Hilda, the eldest daughter, processed her inheritance differently. Born in 1936, she was old enough by war's end to begin understanding what her father had done. She studied education, became a professor, joined the Green Party and served in the Berlin Parliament, including a term as vice president. But her most significant work came through the Zurich Geben Foundation, which she founded. The name means to give back or to return. Hilda sold paintings she inherited from her father, verified not to be stolen Jewish property, unlike so much art from that era, and used the money to support Jewish female artists and cultural projects. The foundation has awarded over 500,000 euros in grants to more than 100 Jewish women. For Hilda, the work was both symbolic and practical restitution. She acknowledged that her father's position had profited from the dispossession and murder of Jews, that she had grown up in privilege built on suffering. She could not undo what had happened, but she could give back a little, a really little. She told her own children the truth about their grandfather, slowly and cautiously, wanting them to understand history without destroying their capacity to love their family. She met with her father after his release and found the encounters difficult. Such a friendly man could have been not only affiliated, but have a leading position in this horrible government which killed so awfully many people. Margaret, the second daughter, became a photographer. She documented architecture, worked on the Topography of Terror exhibition in Berlin, and eventually wrote a memoir titled Sind Sie die Tochter Speer? Are You Speer's daughter? The book, published in 2005, attempted to separate the private father from the public criminal, a psychological project reviewers criticized as impossible and misguided. Critics argued she downplayed his crimes, emphasized his architectural achievements and gentlemanly demeanor, and only briefly addressed his role in expanding Auschwitz and exploiting forced labor. She admitted living in fear of her father's past, preferring to know nothing about it, yet she wrote a book ostensibly confronting it. The Contradiction revealed the impossible position of Nazi children, damned if they engage, damned if they stay silent. Fritz and Arnold maintained the lowest profiles. They avoided commentary, lived ordinary lives, grappled privately with what it meant to be Albert Speer's sons. Arnold, born as Adolf Hitler's namesake, had that particular burden. A name changed, but a connection never severed. What must it have been like to grow up knowing you were named for one of history's greatest monsters? even if your parents later changed it. The renaming itself was an acknowledgement of shame, an admission that association with Hitler had become unbearable. But changing a name on paper doesn't erase the knowledge of what the original name was, why it was chosen, what it represented about your parents' beliefs and loyalties in 1940. Arnold became a doctor, choosing a profession dedicated to healing. He worked as a community physician, treating ordinary people, living quietly away from public attention. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs. He simply lived his life, letting the name Speer fade into medical records rather than headlines. Ernst, the youngest, had the strangest experience. Born in 1942, he was only 3 when his father was arrested. He had no meaningful memories of Speer as a free man. Everything he knew came from Spandau visits, letters, and what his mother and siblings told him. When Speer was released in 1966, Ernst was 24. They were strangers who shared DNA and a surname, but little else. Speer published a second memoir in 1969, The Slave State, about Himmler and the SS. He continued giving interviews, corresponding with historians, positioning himself as the indispensable witness to the Third Reich. He claimed he hoped to resume an architectural career, but his sole project, a collaboration for a brewery, failed. Architecture was no longer his purpose. Myth-making was. He rewrote his own birth circumstances, claiming falsely he was born at midday amid thunder and church bells, when actually it was between 3 and 5 o'clock and the church wasn't built until years later. If he would lie about something so trivial and verifiable, what else had he lied about? He remained married to Margarete but grew distant. He formed a relationship with a German woman living in London, 30 years younger, married to an Englishman. Margarete and the children knew about the affair. It was one more betrayal in a lifetime of emotional absence. On September 1st, 1981, Speer suffered a heart attack in London, where he had gone for a television interview. He died in bed with his mistress. His wife of 53 years was not there. His children were not there. He died as he had lived, focused on his public image, accompanied by someone who had not known him during his Nazi years, someone who saw only the charming, cultured architect, not the war criminal. Margarete died in 1987 at 82, 6 years after Albert. She had waited 20 years for his release, and then lived another 15 years watching him prioritize his reputation over his family. She was buried in the family grave in Heidelberg's Bergfriedhof, where Albert was also buried. They rest together in death with more proximity than they often had in life. The Speer children's stories reveal the range of responses available to the children of Nazi perpetrators. Albert Jr. became a successful architect, founded a firm in Frankfurt that employed over 100 people and became one of Germany's most respected architectural companies. He designed Expo 2000 in Hanover, worked on projects in China including the Shanghai International Automobile City and Beijing's Central Axis, and was involved in Munich's bid for the 2018 Winter Olympics and Qatar's successful bid for the 2022 FIFA World Cup. His work consciously rejected his father's megalomaniacal monumentalism in favor of eco-friendly, human-scale architecture. Yet he also put his talents at the service of authoritarian regimes in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and China, creating a strange echo of his father's willingness to serve power. He died in 2017 at 83. Hilda's path of active restitution and political engagement represented another response, using the privilege of the Speer name and inherited resources to make symbolic amends. She worked to raise awareness about Nazi theft of Jewish property, encouraged Germans to investigate their family histories, and return stolen items, literally or symbolically. She supported Greek efforts to document Nazi atrocities in that country, which received less attention than crimes in Poland and Russia. At 83, she continued this work with determination that observers found humbling, though she sought no glory for it. The contrast with children of other Nazi leaders is instructive. Unlike Gudrun Himmler, who defended her father unwaveringly, or Nicholas Frank, who built a career condemning his father Hans Frank, the Speer children occupied middle ground. Hilda acknowledged her father's crimes while maintaining personal affection for him. Albert Jr. admitted his father's guilt but pursued the same profession. Margaret tried to separate the private man from the public criminal. Fritz and Arnold stayed silent. Each found a different way to carry the burden. The question of Albert Speer's knowledge and culpability has been debated for decades. He claimed at Nuremberg that he didn't know about the Holocaust, that he deliberately avoided learning about Auschwitz when his friend Karl Hanke warned him about disturbing events there. He admitted he should have known that he was guilty of willful blindness, that he bears responsibility for failing to investigate or object. But documents released after his death revealed he knew far more than he admitted. He attended conferences where deportation of Jews was discussed. He approved expansion of Auschwitz. He knew concentration camp prisoners were dying in his factories. His claims of ignorance were lies, carefully constructed to minimize his culpability while maintaining enough contrition to seem believable. His children had to grapple with these revelations. While he lived, they could believe in his remorse, accept his narrative of the technocrat seduced by Hitler's charisma. After his death, as historians deconstructed the Speer myth, they had to acknowledge that their father had lied systematically about his role. He had been more involved in the Holocaust than he admitted. He had been an anti-Semite not through ideology, but through actions. Evicting Jews from Berlin apartments, using Jewish forced labor, enabling the final solution through his armaments work. The man who claimed to be the good Nazi had simply been a better liar than the others. For the Speer family, this created ongoing moral complexity. They could not defend him without defending the indefensible. They could not completely condemn him without condemning someone they had loved or wanted to love. Hilda's foundation work represented one resolution, acknowledging his crimes through restitution without dwelling on personal condemnation. Albert Jr.'s architectural success represented another, proving the name could be associated with achievement rather than just atrocity. Margaret's memoir represented a third, attempting to hold both truths simultaneously, the loving father and the war criminal. The 20-year imprisonment shaped the family in ways that shorter or longer sentences might not have. 20 years was long enough to destroy normal family bonds. The children became adults without him, formed identities independent of his influence, but it was short enough that they had to reckon with his release, had to navigate having him return to their lives. If he had been executed or imprisoned for life, they could have grieved and moved on. If he had served only 10 years like Dnitz, they might have maintained more connection. 20 years was the worst duration, creating permanent distance while requiring ongoing relationship. Post-war Germany struggled with how to treat families of Nazi leaders, and the Speer family occupied a peculiar position. Albert's good Nazi persona created ambiguity. He was convicted of war crimes, but also accepted responsibility. He expressed remorse while lying about the extent of his involvement. He was cultured and educated, not a ranting fanatic. This made him more palatable to the public, but also more dangerous. He represented the idea that nice, normal, intelligent people could participate in genocide, that monsters could be charming, that evil required neither madness nor malice, just ambition and moral cowardice. The children inherited this ambiguity. They were not pariahs like Bormann's children, not defended loyalists like Gudrun Himmler, not high-profile condemners like Nicholas Frank. They were ordinary people carrying an extraordinary burden, trying to build lives while the world debated whether their father was a penitent sinner or an unrepentant liar. The truth, almost certainly, was that he was both genuinely regretful about some aspects of his involvement, while fundamentally dishonest about its extent. Today, Albert Speer is remembered as Hitler's architect and the Nazi who claimed remorse. Historians study his buildings, analyze his armaments production, deconstruct his memoirs, debate his culpability. His family appears in these accounts primarily as biographical detail. Wife Margarete, 6 children, 20 years in Spandau, emotional distance even after release. But they had their own stories, their own struggles with inheritance and identity. Hilda's foundation work continues, providing grants to Jewish women artists, keeping alive the memory of what was stolen and lost. Albert Jr.'s architectural legacy stands in Frankfurt and Shanghai and Beijing, buildings that reject his father's monumentalism while still serving authoritarian power. Margaret's photographs document German history, including the topography of terror. The others live more quietly, carrying the name privately, making their own accommodations with history. The Speer family story reminds us that perpetrators have families who love them despite their crimes, that children bear no responsibility for their parents' actions, yet cannot escape the association, that waiting decades for someone does not guarantee they will be worth the wait. It reminds us that remorse can be genuine and manipulative simultaneously, that accepting responsibility is not the same as telling the truth, that the families of the guilty suffer in ways distinct from but real nonetheless. Margarete waited 20 years for a man who had been emotionally absent before his arrest, and remained so after release. The children waited for a father who never really came home, who spent his freedom constructing myths rather than relationships. They were all casualties of Albert Speer's choices: his decision to join the Nazi Party, to befriend Hitler, to build monuments to a murderous regime, to deploy slave labor, to blind himself to genocide, and then to spend the rest of his life controlling his narrative rather than acknowledging the full truth. The cost was measured not just in the lives lost through his actions, but in the family fractured by his narcissism and lies. Karl Dnitz was Hitler's last successor, the Grand Admiral who commanded Germany's U-boat fleet and briefly led the shattered remnants of the Third Reich in its final days. Unlike Heydrich or Bormann, he survived the war, faced trial at Nuremberg, and lived into old age. But for his wife Ingeborg and their 3 children, the war left wounds that never fully healed. 2 sons died in combat before the war ended. One daughter survived to carry the weight of her father's name into a changed world. Their story is not one of scattered foster homes or anonymous exile, but of a family held together by grief, navigating the complex terrain between loyalty and judgment, between private mourning and public reckoning. May 1943. Ingeborg Dönitz received the telegram every German mother dreaded. Her younger son Peter, 20 years old, was dead. U-954, the submarine where he served as watch officer on his first patrol, had been sunk in the North Atlantic on May 19th. All hands lost. No survivors. Peter had gone to sea with the enthusiasm of youth, following in his father's footsteps, eager to prove himself in the U-boat service that Karl Dönitz had built and commanded. The North Atlantic was a killing ground by 1943. Allied air power and improved detection methods were turning the Battle of the Atlantic against the Germans. U-boats that once hunted in wolf packs now became the hunted, sunk faster than they could be replaced. Peter died in those cold waters, one of approximately 30,000 U-boat men who would perish during the war. Casualties of Karl Dönitz's determination to fight until the very end. For Karl and Ingeborg, the loss was devastating. Hitler, in recognition of the family's sacrifice, issued a policy. If a senior officer lost a son in combat and had other sons still serving, those sons could withdraw from active duty. Klaus, the older brother, was immediately forbidden from any combat role. At 23, he was ordered to leave the military and begin studying to become a naval doctor. He would be safe, removed from the war, preserved for his grieving parents. Klaus accepted this decision, grudgingly perhaps, but accepted it nonetheless. For nearly a year, he studied medicine, preparing for a career that would keep him far from the fighting. But on May 13th, 1944, Klaus turned 24. It was his birthday. His friends were preparing to take the E-boat S-141 on a raid against Selsey on the English coast. E-boats were fast motor torpedo boats, deadly in hit-and-run attacks, but vulnerable to superior enemy forces. Klaus asked, begged perhaps, to go along. Just this once. Just for his birthday. His friends relented. They should not have. The boat went out that night and encountered the French destroyer La Combattante. In the engagement that followed, S-141 was sunk. 6 men were rescued from the water. Klaus was not among them. He died on his 24th birthday, despite Hitler's order, despite his father's position, despite everything that should have protected him. Ingeborg received the second telegram barely a year after the first. Both sons gone. Peter and Klaus, the boys she had raised, were dead. The grief was annihilating. For Karl Dönitz, the losses came at a time when he was ascending to even greater power and responsibility. In January 1943, shortly before Peter's death, he had been promoted to Grand Admiral and replaced Erich Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the entire German Navy. He was coordinating U-boat operations across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Arctic. He was in daily contact with Hitler, making strategic decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of men. And yet, his own sons were dying in the war he was helping to prosecute. The Dönitz family had never been large. Karl and Ingeborg had married on May 27, 1916, during World War I. Karl was serving as a submarine officer. Ingeborg Weber was the daughter of General Erich Weber, a career military man who understood the demands of service. She had trained as a nurse, modern for her time, described as having a mind of her own. They raised 3 children as Protestant Christians. Daughter Ursula, born in 1917, and sons Klaus, born in 1920, and Peter, born in 1922. The family lived the peripatetic life of a naval officer's household. moving as Karl's career advanced through the interwar Reichsmarine and into the Nazi-era Kriegsmarine. In 1937, Ursula married Günther Hessler, himself a U-boat commander and eventual recipient of the Knight's Cross. The marriage connected two submarine warfare families, binding them together in the tight community of naval officers who would fight the Battle of the Atlantic. Ursula and Günther had 3 children together, 2 sons named Peter and Klaus, named undoubtedly for Ursula's brothers, and a daughter named Ute. The family expanded even as war approached, creating a new generation that would grow up in the shadow of their grandfathers and fathers' service. Karl Dnitz was a dedicated Nazi. He admired Hitler openly, praised his leadership, and believed in the righteousness of the cause. In August 1943, months after Peter's death, he spoke of Hitler's foresightedness and confidence, declaring that anyone who thinks he can do better than the Führer is stupid. On German Heroes Day in March 1944, just 2 months before Klaus died, Dönitz gave a speech warning that without Hitler and National Socialism, Germany would be beset by the poison of Jewry and destroyed. He spoke of the need for an uncompromising ideology to sustain the nation through the war. These were not the words of a reluctant follower or a professional soldier simply doing his duty. They were the words of a true believer. Ingeborg's political views are less documented, but she lived within this ideology, raised her children in it, accepted the framework it provided for understanding the world. The Dönitz household was not one of quiet resistance or private doubts. It was a Nazi household, committed to the regime, bound up in its military apparatus, benefiting from the privileges Karl's position provided. The family lived well during the war years, insulated from the worst privations that ordinary Germans faced, protected by rank and status, even as the nation crumbled. Then came April 1945. Hitler, trapped in his bunker beneath Berlin as Soviet forces closed in, chose Karl Dönitz as his successor. In his last will and testament, Hitler named Dönitz the new president of the Reich and supreme commander of the armed forces. Joseph Goebbels was named chancellor, creating what became known briefly as the Flensburg government, after Dönitz established his headquarters in that northern German city. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Dönitz, still reeling from the loss of both his sons, suddenly found himself responsible for a nation in its death throes. Dönitz held power for 23 days. In that time, he attempted to negotiate separate surrenders to the Western Allies while keeping German forces fighting in the east. He hoped to save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity, to facilitate an orderly withdrawal to preserve what could be preserved. On May 4th, German forces in the Netherlands, Denmark and northwestern Germany surrendered to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On May 7th, Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at Reims. The war in Europe was over. On May 23rd, Allied forces dissolved the Flensburg government and arrested Dönitz and his cabinet. He was taken into custody, held as a prisoner of war, and eventually transferred to Nuremberg to face trial as a major war criminal. For Ingeborg and Ursula, the arrest meant uncertainty. Karl was gone, imprisoned, facing charges that could result in execution. They had no income, no protection, no clear future. The family property, whatever they had accumulated during Karl's career, was subject to confiscation. They were the wife and daughter of a man about to be tried for war crimes, labelled as Nazi leadership, associated with a regime that had brought catastrophic destruction to Europe. Yet, unlike the families of Heydrich or Bormann, they were not fleeing occupation zones or hiding their identities. Karl Dönitz had been a military officer, not SS, not party hierarchy. His crimes, if he had committed any, were those of a naval commander, not a genocide administrator. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg indicted Dönitz on 3 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution argued he had planned and waged aggressive war, had violated the laws of war through unrestricted submarine warfare, and had used concentration camp labour in shipyards. Dönitz's defence centred on his role as a professional military officer following orders. He claimed ignorance of Nazi atrocities, denied knowledge of concentration camps beyond their mere existence, and argued that his naval operations were standard military practice employed by all sides. The trial revealed uncomfortable truths. American Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz submitted testimony that the United States Navy had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan in the Pacific, torpedoing merchant vessels without warning. If Dnitz was guilty of war crimes for ordering U-boats to attack Allied shipping without warning, then by the same standard, American commanders were equally guilty. The judges, recognizing this moral equivalency, declined to convict Dnitz solely on the submarine warfare charges. However, they found him guilty of waging aggressive war and of war crimes related to his role in the overall German military machine. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal sentenced Karl Dnitz to 10 years imprisonment. It was the lightest sentence given to any major Nazi leader convicted at Nuremberg, aside from those fully acquitted. He had escaped execution. Unlike Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and 9 others who were hanged on October 16th, Dnitz would live. He was sent to Spandau prison in Berlin, along with 6 other convicted Nazis: Rudolf Hess, Walter Funk, Erich Raeder, Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, and Konstantin von Neurath. For Ingeborg, the sentence brought relief mixed with continued hardship. 10 years. Her husband would be nearly 70 when released if he survived imprisonment, but he would survive. She could visit him, write to him, wait for him. She moved to a small town near Hamburg, living quietly, supported by whatever savings remained and possibly assistance from Ursula and Günther. The years of waiting began. She watched as other Spandau prisoners were released, Neurath in 1954, Raeder in 1955, while Karl's sentence continued. She grew older, her health declining, the losses of her sons aging her beyond her years. Dnitz proved a difficult prisoner. He maintained his Nazi beliefs, refused to express remorse, and insisted he had done nothing wrong. In April 1953, he told Albert Speer that if it had been the Americans' choice and not the Jews', he would have been released already. The remark revealed his continuing anti-Semitism, his refusal to acknowledge the Holocaust, his determination to see himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Prison did not change him. If anything, it hardened his convictions, confirmed his sense of persecution, reinforced his belief that he had been unfairly judged. On October 1, 1956, after serving his full 10-year sentence, Karl Dnitz walked out of Spandau prison. He was 65 years old. Ingeborg was 63. They reunited after a decade of separation, both aged, both marked by loss and imprisonment, both facing an uncertain future in a Germany that had moved on without them. They settled in Aumühle, a small village near Hamburg in northern West Germany. It was quiet, isolated, far from the centres of power where Karl had once operated. They lived on a government pension, the same pension paid to any retired military officer, a fact that generated little public controversy compared to the pensions awarded to widows of SS officers and party officials. Dnitz spent his retirement writing. In 1958, he published Memoirs 10 Years and 20 Days, recounting his decade commanding U-boats and his 20 days as Germany's head of state. The book maintained his innocence, insisted he had known nothing of Nazi atrocities, and portrayed himself as a professional naval officer caught up in events beyond his control. The memoir sold well in Germany and was translated into multiple languages. In 1968, he published a second volume, Mein Wechselvolles Leben, which attacked the Nuremberg trial process more directly and defended his Nazi ideology more explicitly. Ingeborg died in 1962, 6 years after Karl's release, at 69. She had lost both her sons, watched her husband's imprisonment, and rebuilt a modest life only to have a handful of years before her death. Karl died on December 24, 1980, at 89. His funeral drew thousands, including approximately 100 holders of the Knight's Cross. The German government forbade military uniforms, fearing the funeral would become a neo-Nazi rally. He was buried at Waldfriedhof Cemetery in Aumühle. Ursula, the sole surviving child, lived a quieter life than her father. She and Günther Hessler raised their 3 children, Peter, Klaus, and Ute, in the post-war years, navigating the complexities of being a U-boat commander's family in a nation trying to distance itself from its military past. The boys were named after Ursula's dead brothers, keeping their memory alive in the next generations, ensuring that Peter and Klaus Dnitz would not be forgotten even as the family tried to move forward. Günther died in 1968 at 58. Ursula survived him by more than 2 decades, dying in 1990 at 73. She witnessed the complete transformation of Germany, the economic miracle, the building of the Berlin Wall and its eventual fall, the reunification of the nation her father had briefly led. The Hessler grandchildren faced the question all descendants of Nazi officials faced: what to do with that inheritance? Their grandfather had been a naval officer, a submarine commander, someone who fought a military war rather than organizing civilian exterminations. This distinction mattered to some, allowed a degree of moral separation. But Dnitz had also been a Nazi, a Hitler loyalist, someone who gave speeches about the poison of Jewry and praised the Führer's uncompromising ideology. He had been tried, convicted, and imprisoned for his role in the regime. The grandchildren could not escape that reality, unlike some children of Nazis who publicly repudiated their fathers, or others who defended them vocally. Ursula and her children chose relative silence. They did not give interviews to journalists, did not write memoirs exploring their complex inheritance, did not engage in public debates about their grandfather's legacy. They lived ordinary lives, removed from historical controversies, letting Karl Dnitz remain a figure of history rather than a living family connection actively discussed at dinner tables. This silence may have been strategic, a way to avoid the judgment and questioning that publicity would bring, or it may have been simple exhaustion, a desire to move forward rather than constantly looking back at a past they could not change. The contrast between the Dnitz family's experience and that of other Nazi families is instructive. They did not scatter into anonymity like the Bormann children. Karl faced trial, served his sentence, and lived openly afterward. His family stayed with him and absorbed the social stigma, but they also benefited from his military rather than political role, from the moral complexity of naval warfare versus genocide. This calculus was always questionable. Dnitz knew about concentration camps from 1934, by his own admission. He ordered 12,000 concentration camp prisoners to work in shipyards in 1944. Knowing where those prisoners came from, he gave speeches praising Hitler and condemning Jews with language that revealed his ideological commitment, not just professional obedience. He waged war until the last moment, sacrificing thousands of U-boat crews in operations with no strategic value, simply to maintain pressure on the Allies while Germany collapsed. These were choices, not just military necessity. They were ideological commitments that resulted in suffering and death. Yet Nuremberg and German society afterward treated him more leniently than other Nazi leaders. He had not directly participated in the Holocaust's machinery of death. His crimes occurred in the context of conventional military operations that all sides practiced to some degree. Unrestricted submarine warfare, for instance, was employed by the American Navy against Japan. He had been a line officer for most of the war, not a policymaker, elevated to supreme command only in its final phase. This leniency meant the family could rebuild together rather than being torn apart by execution or permanent imprisonment. It meant Ursula could know her father in his final decades, could visit him in Aumühle, could bring her children to meet their grandfather. But it also meant they never had to fully reckon with what he had supported, never had to acknowledge the complete moral weight of his choices, never had to apologize or seek forgiveness. The story raises questions about collective responsibility and inherited guilt that German society wrestled with for generations. Should Ursula have borne responsibility for her father's actions? Should her children have been expected to publicly condemn him? Ursula was an adult during the Nazi period, married to a U-boat commander, presumably. Supportive of her father and husband's roles in the war effort. But she was also a daughter who lost 2 brothers, a sister who mourned, a woman navigating an impossible situation where family loyalty and historical judgment pulled in opposite directions. Her silence after the war could be read as complicity or simply as survival, as protecting her own children from the burden of their grandfather's name and the endless questions that would follow any public statement. The grandchildren were even further removed. Born after the war or in its final years, they had no agency in the events that defined their grandfather's life. They inherited a name and a history, nothing more. German society's expectation that they should publicly atone for crimes they did not commit was both understandable and deeply unfair. They could acknowledge the history, educate themselves about it, ensure they did not repeat the patterns of denial and nationalism that had enabled the Third Reich. But they could not change what had happened, could not undo their grandfather's choices, could not escape the biological fact of their descent from Karl Dnitz. Post-war Germany struggled with how to treat families of Nazi leaders. The legal system generally sided with compassion. Children were not prosecuted, denied education, or formally ostracized. But social consequences remained. The Dnitz family navigated this by maintaining low profiles, allowing the name to fade from immediate public consciousness even as historians continued to study Karl's role. The question of pensions is worth examining. Dnitz received a standard military pension after release, treated as a retired naval officer rather than a convicted war criminal. This generated less outrage than SS pensions, perhaps because naval service seemed more normal than paramilitary operations. The deaths of Peter and Klaus remain tragic centerpieces of the family story. They died young, in their early 20s, fighting for a cause that would bring nothing but devastation to their nation. They died believing in that cause, or at least believing in their duty to serve it, never living to see how history would judge the war they fought. Their deaths devastated their parents and sister, left holes in the family that could never be filled. Yet they also died as soldiers in a war their father helped prosecute, casualties of the very strategy Karl Dnitz designed and commanded. The irony was inescapable. The architect of U-boat warfare lost his own son to that warfare, and then lost his second son when Klaus defied protective orders to participate in a raid that achieved nothing strategic. For Ursula, the loss of both brothers meant she became the sole bearer of the family legacy. She was the only child who survived to see her father released from prison, the only one who grew old, the only one who had children to carry the Dnitz name forward. This placed enormous psychological weight on her. She was the repository of family memories, the link between Karl's youth and his old age, the person who remembered Peter and Klaus as living brothers rather than memorialized casualties. Her decision to remain silent about her family's history, to avoid public discussion of her father's role or her brother's deaths, may have been the only way she could carry that weight without being crushed by it. Today, Karl Dnitz is remembered primarily as a naval commander and Hitler's brief successor. Historians study his U-boat tactics, debate the effectiveness of the convoy system versus the Wolfpack strategy, analyze his role in the final days of the Nazi regime. He appears in documentaries about submarine warfare, books about Nuremberg, studies of the Battle of the Atlantic. His family rarely appears in these accounts except as biographical details. Wife Ingeborg, daughter Ursula, sons Peter and Klaus, killed in action. They are footnotes supporting characters in his story rather than protagonists of their own. But they had their own story, one of loss and grief, of loyalty tested by imprisonment, of survival in a nation that had to remake itself after catastrophic moral failure. Ingeborg lost her sons and her husband's freedom, buried her boys and waited through a decade of separation, finally had a few brief years with Karl before her own death. Ursula lost her brothers and then her father to imprisonment, raised her own children in the shadow of that loss, navigated the impossible terrain between family loyalty and historical judgment. The grandchildren grew up knowing they were descended from a Grand Admiral and a convicted war criminal, two facts that coexisted uneasily in their family history. The Dnitz family's story reminds us that history is not just about the great men who make decisions and give orders. It is also about the families who live with the consequences of those decisions, who mourn the dead, who wait for the imprisoned, who carry names that become synonymous with events they did not control. It reminds us that judgment is complicated, that naval officers who fought conventional wars occupy a different moral category than genocidal bureaucrats, even when both serve the same monstrous regime. It reminds us that leniency has its own costs, that allowing unrepentant Nazis to live free and write memoirs creates its own form of injustice, even as harsh punishment of elderly men achieves little beyond symbolic satisfaction. Karl Dnitz lived a long life, died peacefully at home, and was honoured by thousands at his funeral. This outcome was controversial then and remains controversial now. Some argue he got off too lightly, that 10 years for waging aggressive war and using concentration camp labour was insufficient punishment. Others argue that, as a military officer following orders in wartime, he was no more culpable than any commander on any side. The debate continues, unresolved because there are no easy answers to questions about command, responsibility, about the difference between legal orders and illegal ones, about where professional duty ends and personal criminality begins. His family, Ingeborg, Ursula, the grandchildren, lived in the space between these competing narratives. They could not fully embrace either position without betraying some part of their own experience. They could not say Karl was simply a soldier doing his duty because he gave speeches about Jewish poison and praised Nazi ideology with evident conviction. But they couldn't say he was a monster, because he was also a husband and father who mourned his dead sons, who showed them affection, who provided for them. They lived with the contradiction, carried it through decades, and mostly chose silence over explanation. That silence was its own form of answer, a refusal to defend or condemn, an acknowledgement that some questions have no satisfying resolution, that some wounds never fully heal, that history's judgment and personal memory sometimes cannot be reconciled.